Picture this. It's April 1899. You're standing in Barron County, Wisconsin, and the land in front of you looks like a battlefield. White pine stumps, some of them 4 feet across, jut out of the ground as far as you can see. 12,000 stumps on this 40-acre plot alone. Each one has roots that spread 15 feet in every direction, tangled and twisted through soil that hasn't seen sunlight in 10,000 years. You've got an axe, you've got a shovel, you've got a team of horses that cost you everything you saved for 3 years. And you've been told this land will be worth something once it's cleared. 1 stump, 1 man. 3 days of backbreaking labor if you're lucky. If the ground isn't frozen. If the roots don't wrap around a boulder. If your back doesn't give out and your hands don't blister until they bleed. 12,000 stumps on 40 acres. That's not 4 years of work. That's not 8 years. That's a lifetime sentence to a task that will destroy your body long before you finish. But there's a man in this county who's about to change everything. His name is Lars Gustiffson. He owns 6 machines. He employs 20 men and maintains 40 horses. And in the next 7 months, his operation will pull 47,312 stumps from the Wisconsin earth. 1 man, 6 machines, 47,000 stumps. 1 season. This is the story of how 1 machine, and the men who mastered it, turned America's cutover wastelands into the dairy farms that feed a nation. And it's the story of what that transformation cost the men who made it happen. Let's start with what you were actually facing if you bought cutover land in the upper Midwest in the 1890s. The lumber companies had taken everything worth taking. For 40 years, they'd worked their way through the great northern forests of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. They'd cut down white pines that had stood for 300 years, trees so tall and so straight that a single trunk could yield enough lumber to build an entire house. They'd hauled out millions of board feet of timber on rivers and railroads and left behind a wasteland. The slash. That's what they called the debris. The branches and treetops and bark that the lumber companies didn't want. It lay rotted across the ground, sometimes 3 and 4 feet deep, a tangle of dead wood that bred mosquitoes and caught fire in dry summers. And rising up through that slash, the stumps stood like tombstones in a graveyard that stretched for miles. This was the land the speculators bought. Pennies an acre, sometimes a nickel. The lumber companies were happy to sell, because what else were they going to do with it? The timber was gone, the land was worthless. Or so they thought. But the speculators saw something different. They saw opportunity. They took out advertisements in newspapers in New York and Boston and Philadelphia. They printed pamphlets in Swedish and German and Norwegian. They sent agents to meet the immigrant ships coming into the ports of the eastern seaboard. Farm this land, they told the families stepping off the boats with everything they owned in a single trunk. Clear the stumps, and you'll have the richest soil in America. Black dirt that's been building for millennia under those pines. 40 acres for what you'd pay for 2 acres back in the old country. What they didn't mention was what it actually took to clear those stumps. A white pine stump isn't like the stumps you see today when someone cuts down a tree in their backyard. Those modern stumps come from trees that might be a foot across, maybe 2 feet if it's an old oak in someone's front yard. You can dig around them in an afternoon. You can burn them out in a weekend. They're inconveniences. The white pines of the North Woods were something else entirely. The trees had been 4, 5, 6 feet in diameter at the base. Some of them were even larger. Trees so big that 2 men standing on opposite sides couldn't see each other around the trunk. Trees that had been growing since before Columbus sailed, adding another ring of growth every year, putting down roots deeper and wider with each passing decade. When the lumber companies cut them down, they left stumps that weighed tons. Not hundreds of pounds, tons. A single stump from a mature white pine could weigh as much as a draft horse. And those stumps had roots. The root system of a mature white pine spreads outward 15 feet in every direction from the trunk. The main roots are as thick as a man's thigh. The secondary roots spread out from those, maybe as thick as a wrist. And the tertiary roots spread out from those, creating an underground network that looks like a wooden octopus buried beneath the soil. Those roots went everywhere, down into the clay beneath the topsoil, out across the plot into your neighbor's land, wrapped around boulders that glaciers had deposited 10,000 years before. A single root might run 30 feet from the trunk before it petered out. This is what the immigrants found when they arrived at their new farms. Not open fields ready for plowing, not the rich black soil they'd been promised, lying there waiting for seeds. Just stumps. Thousands of stumps. Stumps as far as they could see in every direction, with slash piled between them, and mosquitoes swarming over everything. And they had to get those stumps out before they could plant a single seed. The first method farmers tried was digging. It was the obvious solution. The stump is in the ground, so you dig around it until you can pull it out. Simple. Logical. What else would you do? You took a shovel and a mattock, and you started digging around the stump until you exposed the first layer of roots. Then you took an axe and chopped through each root, one by one, swinging until your shoulders burned and your hands cracked. Then you dug deeper. Then you found more roots. Then you chopped those. Then you dug deeper still. The deeper you went, the harder the digging became. The soil near the surface was loose, but down below it turned to clay, sticky and heavy. And below that it turned to hardpan, soil so compacted by glaciers that it was nearly solid as stone. And the roots kept coming, layer after layer of them. Every time you thought you'd cut through the last root, you'd dig deeper and find another one. A single stump could take 3 days this way. 3 full days of dawn to dusk labor for one man. And by the end, your hands were bleeding through your gloves and your back was screaming. And you had to spend the 4th day lying in bed because you couldn't stand up straight. 3 days. 1 stump. 12,000 stumps on 40 acres. You do the math. A farmer named Henrik Lindquist in Polk County did the math. He'd arrived from Sweden in 1887 with his wife Anna and their 3 children. He bought 80 acres of cutover land for what seemed like a reasonable price. He built a 1-room cabin and started digging stumps. He spent 2 entire summers at it, June through September, 1888 and 1889. Dawn to dusk, every day except Sunday, just digging. His wife helped when she could. His oldest son, who was 12, helped when he wasn't needed for other chores. Together, they cleared 11 acres in those 2 years. 11 acres out of 80. They had 69 more to go. His wife found him one morning in the summer of 1890, sitting on a stump at the edge of the cleared section, staring at nothing. She asked him what was wrong. He told her he'd done the calculation. At his current pace, he'd be 73 years old before the farm was clear. He was 31. So farmers tried burning. The theory was simple. Build fires around the stumps, keep them burning for days, and eventually the wood would turn to ash, and you could pull out what remained with a team of horses. It seemed logical. Wood burns. Fire destroys wood. Therefore, fire destroys stumps. What could go wrong? But white pine stumps were saturated with pitch and resin. The same qualities that made pine lumber so valuable for construction, that resistance to rot and weather, made pine stumps incredibly resistant to burning. They didn't catch fire easily, and when they didn't burn clean. They smoldered. They caught fire on the outside and burned for a while. But then the resin would melt and run, coating the interior in a sticky protective layer that wouldn't burn. The fire would go out. You'd come back the next morning and find a blackened stump that was still solid as rock, still anchored by roots the fire couldn't reach. One farmer in Burnett County tried the burning method for an entire season. His name was Olaf Johansson, and he kept a diary of his efforts that his descendants donated to the County Historical Society decades later. Every day for 4 months, he built fires around stumps on his property. He fed those fires with the slash and debris left by the lumber companies. He watched the smoke rise and prayed that when it cleared, the stumps would be gone. He managed to weaken about 60 stumps, enough to pull them out with his horses. 60 stumps in 4 months of constant effort. He had 4,000 more on his property. At that rate, it would take him 266 years to clear his land. Then there was blasting. Dynamite had become available by the 1880s, and some farmers thought this was the answer. Pack holes with explosive, light the fuse, run like hell, and blow the stump out of the ground. Modern technology solving an ancient problem. The technique required drilling holes into the stump, usually 3 or 4 of them, angled downward toward the center. You'd fill those holes with dynamite, set a long fuse, and retreat to what you hoped was a safe distance. The problem was it worked too well and not well enough at the same time. The explosion would shatter the stump into 1,000 pieces of flying wood that could kill a man standing 50 yards away. Shrapnel, that's what it was. Wooden shrapnel traveling at speeds that could punch through a barn wall. You had to make sure everyone was behind cover before you lit that fuse, and even then you prayed that no one had misjudged the distance. But it wouldn't get the roots. You'd blow a stump to splinters and find that every major root was still anchored in the ground, now even harder to remove because there was nothing left to grab onto. The stump was gone, but the root system remained, and you still couldn't plow through it. You'd have to dig out every root individually, starting the whole miserable process over again. A farmer named Gustav Bergman lost his right eye to a flying wood fragment during a stump blast in 1891. He'd served in the Union Army during the Civil War, 4 years of battle, Antietam, Gettysburg, the Wilderness. He'd charged Confederate positions and survived. He'd watched men die beside him and kept going. He'd come through the whole bloody mess without a scratch. A white pine stump in Wisconsin took what Confederate rifles couldn't. And still the stumps remained. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Millions across the cutover region of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. Land that should have been worth $20 an acre was worth $2. Land that should have fed families sat useless, generating nothing but property taxes that the farmers couldn't pay and heartbreak they couldn't escape. The immigrants who'd bought it were trapped. They couldn't farm it because the stumps wouldn't come out. They couldn't sell it because nobody wanted land covered in stumps. They couldn't abandon it because they'd spent everything they had to buy it. And leaving meant losing everything they'd saved for years in the old country. Some of them tried anyway. The cutover region of the upper Midwest is dotted with the remnants of failed homesteads from this era. Collapsed cabins half hidden by second-growth forest that grew back after the families gave up. Stone foundations with birch trees growing up through the middle. Graves with Swedish and Norwegian names on the headstones. Markers for families who tried and failed and died where they'd hoped to make a new life. That desperation created a market. Desperate people will pay for solutions. And the market created machines. The Hercules Manufacturing Company of Centerville, Iowa, didn't set out to save Wisconsin farmers. They set out to make money. And by 1885, they'd figured out something that would make them very rich indeed. The basic principle wasn't new. Men had been using leverage to move heavy objects since the Egyptians built the pyramids. A lever multiplies force. A longer lever multiplies force more. Apply enough mechanical advantage, and a small force can move an enormous weight. Archimedes said he could move the world if you gave him a lever long enough and a place to stand. The Hercules engineers didn't move the world. They just moved stumps. But they did it by applying that same ancient principle in a way that nobody had quite managed before. Here's how it worked. The Hercules stump puller was essentially a giant spool mounted on a wooden frame. The frame was built from heavy oak timbers, 8 by 8 inches in cross-section, bolted together with iron plates at the corners. The whole thing sat on wooden skids, like the runners of a giant sled, that distributed its weight across the ground and kept it stable during operation. The complete machine weighed over 1,000 pounds. At the center of the frame was a drum, maybe 2 feet in diameter, made of cast iron. Wrapped around that drum was steel cable. Hundreds of feet of it. That cable ran out to the stump and hooked around a heavy chain that went under the roots. But here's the genius. The drum didn't connect directly to the horses. It connected through a system of gears and cogs that traded speed for power. Think of it like the gears on a bicycle, but in reverse. On a bicycle, the gears let you trade effort for speed. You pedal harder and you go faster. On the Hercules, the gears traded speed for power. The horses moved at their normal walking pace, but the drum turned slowly, very slowly. Maybe 1 rotation for every 20 feet the horses walked. And that slowness translated into tremendous pulling force. A single horse walking at 2 miles per hour could generate pulling force of over 10 tons through that gear system. 2 horses doubled it. 4 horses, which was the standard team for a big Hercules, could exert 40 tons of pulling force on a stump that might weigh 1 ton. 40 tons. That's 80,000 pounds of force applied slowly, steadily, relentlessly, to a stump that had resisted everything else. That's more force than the stump was designed to withstand, more than the roots could grip against, more than the earth itself could hold on to. The physics were simple. The result looked like magic. I've read accounts from farmers who watched a Hercules work for the first time. They use words like impossible and miraculous and witchcraft. One man wrote to his brother back in Sweden that he'd seen the Americans build a machine that could pull the earth inside out. Another described it as watching the land give up its dead. The operation went like this. The crew would roll the Hercules into position about 50 feet from the stump. They'd dig anchor holes behind it and set heavy wooden beams into those holes to keep the machine from sliding forward when the cable tightened. Then they'd run the cable out to the stump. The hookman would crawl under the stump and around the roots, threading a heavy logging chain through the root mass. He'd look for the biggest roots, the main structural supports that held the stump in place, and he'd wrap the chain around them so that when the pull came, the force would be distributed across the entire root system. This was skilled work. Hook the chain wrong, and it would slip off when the tension built up. Or it would cut through the roots unevenly, leaving the stump anchored on one side while the other side tore free. The best hookmen could read a stump the way a surgeon reads an X-ray. They could look at it and know exactly where to place the chain for maximum effect. Once the chain was set, the cable would be connected to it with a heavy iron shackle. The horses would be hitched to the sweep arm, a long wooden beam that stuck out from the side of the machine like the spoke of a giant wheel. When the driver called out, the horses would start walking in a circle. The sweep arm would turn the gears would turn the drum, the cable would go taut, and then you'd hear it. A sound like nothing else in the world. The cable would sing under tension, a high-pitched whine that got higher and higher as the force built up. The steel strands that made up the cable would stretch and vibrate, and the whole length of it would hum like a guitar string being tuned up several octaves. The ground around the stump would start to crack. Small fissures at first, radiating outward from the base like cracks in ice. Then larger ones. You'd see the soil heave and buckle as the roots began to move underground. Roots that had been buried for centuries would suddenly break the surface, snapping like gunshots as they tore free from the earth. And then the stump would come up. Slowly at first, tilting to one side as the main roots gave way. Then, faster, as the secondary roots let go. And finally, the whole mass would tear free from the earth in a shower of dirt and broken wood, leaving a crater 5 feet deep and 10 feet across. What had taken a man 3 days now took 30 minutes. What had seemed impossible was now routine. But the machine could kill you just as easily as it could clear your land. By 1890, the Hercules Manufacturing Company was selling thousands of these machines across the cutover region. They came in different sizes. The smallest, the number 1, was designed for stumps up to 2 feet across and could be operated by a single horse. The largest, the number 4, required 4 horses and could pull stumps that 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around. The price ranged from $75 for the smallest model to $200 for the largest. That was a lot of money in 1890, a year's wages for a farm laborer, more than some families earned in 2 years of hard work. But the economics made sense. A farmer who bought a Hercules could clear his own land in years instead of decades, and then he could rent the machine to his neighbors and make his money back. Communities started forming cooperatives to buy machines together, sharing the cost and the equipment among a dozen families. This was one of America's earliest forms of agricultural cooperation, born out of desperation and sustained by mutual need. And some men looked at those economics and saw something bigger. Lars Gustiffson arrived in Barron County in 1889. He was 34 years old, Swedish-born, and he'd spent 10 years working in the lumber camps of northern Wisconsin. He'd seen what happened to the land after the timber was gone. He'd seen the immigrants arrive with hope in their eyes and watched that hope drain away as they confronted the stumps. He'd also seen the Hercules machines. He'd watched them work in demonstrations put on by company salesmen. He'd done the math. A crew with a Hercules could clear 40 acres in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. A single farmer with a shovel would spend a lifetime on the same job. And farmers were desperate. They'd pay almost anything to have someone else deal with the stumps. By 1895, Gustiffson owned 2 Hercules machines. By 1898, he owned 6. He didn't use them on his own land. He had no land of his own. He was in the stump-pulling business. His operation was something between a traveling circus and a military campaign. 20 men, 40 horses, 6 massive machines mounted on wagons that could haul them from farm to farm across the rutted dirt roads of northern Wisconsin. Thousands of feet of steel cable coiled on wooden spools, a portable forge for making repairs in the field, wagons full of replacement parts, and spare chains and cable clamps, a cook wagon and a sleeping wagon for the men who worked 14-hour days through the Wisconsin summer. 8 men to a sleeping wagon, bunked 3 high on wooden shelves with straw mattresses that became infested with lice by July. The ledgers from Gustiffson's operations still exist in the Barron County Historical Society. Bound volumes with faded ink, the careful handwriting of a man who understood that profit came from tracking every expense. I've spent hours with those pages, and they tell a story that the promotional materials from Hercules Manufacturing never mentioned. The 1899 season, April 15th through October 30th. 199 working days, 47,312 stumps pulled. Let that number settle. 47,000 stumps in one season. That's an average of 238 stumps per day, every day, for nearly 7 months. Sundays off for church, but not Saturdays. 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset, while the mosquitoes swarmed and the sun beat down, and the cables sang their high-pitched song. The men worked in crews of 3 or 4 per machine. 1 man to drive the horses, walking behind them all day as they circled the sweep arm. 1 man to hook the chains, crawling under stumps and wrestling with iron links that weighed 20 pounds each. 1 man to reset the cable after each pull, handling steel wire that could slice through leather gloves like they were paper. They rotated positions throughout the day because each job destroyed your body in a different way. The driver walked miles every day behind the horses as they circled the sweep arm, round and round, 12 hours a day, following behind the team while they pulled and the cable wound around the drum. By the end of the season, drivers had walked distances that would take them from Wisconsin to California and back. The hook man had the most dangerous job. He crawled under stumps and around roots, threading heavy chains into position while the dirt fell in his eyes and the bugs swarmed his face. The mosquitoes of northern Wisconsin in summer are legendary. They'd bite through clothing. They'd swarm so thick you couldn't breathe without inhaling them. And the hook man was down there in the mud and the muck, trying to thread a chain through a root system while the stump creaked and groaned above him. If the stump shifted while he was under it, if a root gave way unexpectedly, he could be pinned, crushed, killed before anyone could dig him out. The cable man handled steel wire that could slice through leather gloves like they were paper. When a cable is under tension, it stores tremendous energy. If it snaps, that energy releases all at once, and the cable whips back with enough force to cut a man in half. 2 men were killed that way in Wisconsin during the 1890s. Not in Gustiffson's crew, but in other operations. The cable would snap without warning, and before anyone could move, it would be over. 1 second a man was standing there doing his job. The next second, he was dead. Gustiffson's ledgers record everything. The meticulous record-keeping of a businessman who understood that profit came from tracking every expense and every dollar earned. 185 tons of feed for the horses over the 1899 season. Oats and hay hauled in from farms across the county, because 40 horses working all day eat more than you can imagine. A working horse needs 20 pounds of hay and 10 pounds of grain per day. Multiply that by 40 horses. Multiply that by 199 days, and you get numbers that seem impossible. 23 cables snapped over the season, each one a moment of pure terror for the men working nearby, each one a delay while the cable man spliced the broken ends back together or unreeled a new section from the supply wagon. 14 chains broken, chains that were supposed to be unbreakable, made from iron links as thick as a man's thumb, snapping under the tremendous forces involved in ripping a stump from the earth. And $127 in injury settlements for the 1899 season. That number stopped me when I first read it. $127. 20 men worked that season. $127 divided by 20 is $6.35 per man. $6 for an entire season. That's what a season of broken bones and crushed hands was worth. That's what you got when a cable tore open your arm or a chain link snapped and caught you across the face. That's what your family received when you went home at the end of the season, unable to work for the next 3 months because something in your back had given out permanently. $6 and a handshake, if you were lucky. The workers accepted it because what else were they going to do? They were immigrants, most of them. Swedes, Norwegians, Germans, Finns. They spoke English poorly or not at all. They had no land, no education, no skills that anyone would pay more for, no options beyond this brutal seasonal work or something even worse. The alternative was going back to digging stumps by hand. The alternative was spending your whole life trying to clear 40 acres that a Hercules crew could clear in 2 weeks. And that's the economics that nobody talked about when they celebrated the conquest of the cutover region. A crew clearing 40 acres in 2 weeks had transformed worthless scrubland into farmland worth hundreds of dollars more. $400, $500, depending on the soil and the location. The farmer who owned that property captured all of that value. Or the land speculator who'd bought the cutover land from the lumber company for pennies and was now selling it to immigrants for dollars. They paid Gustiffson maybe $100 for the clearing work, and their property went up in value by 4 or 5 times that amount. The workers just got their daily wage, $2. Maybe $3 if Gustiffson was feeling generous, or if the crew was working a particularly difficult stretch with lots of boulders tangled in the roots. The men who did this work left almost no records of their own. They were immigrants, most of them. They came from the same places and the same circumstances as the farmers who hired them. But instead of buying land and trying to build something permanent, they sold their labor one season at a time. They signed their names with an X on the company ledgers because they couldn't write. They lived in the sleeping wagons during the season, and they went back to whatever they could find when the season ended. Logging camps in the winter, construction crews in the cities, farm labor during harvest. An endless circuit of brutal work that followed the rhythms of the northern year. I've tried to trace them. It's almost impossible. A first name here, a last name there. Ola, Sven, Henrik, Gunnar. They appear in the ledgers as entries next to dollar amounts, and then they disappear. One entry caught my eye. July 14th, 1899. Settled with Nils Olsson, $4.50 for injury to left hand. That's all. No explanation of what happened to Nils Olsson's left hand, no indication of how severe the injury was. Just a dollar amount and a name. Where did Nils Olsson go after July 14th, 1899? Did he ever work again? Did he have a wife and children somewhere who depended on his wages? Did he die of infection in some boarding house? Or did he recover and sign on with another crew the following spring, with a hand that never worked quite right again? The records don't say. The records never say. But the land they cleared? That we can trace. Every acre of it. 40 acres that took 2 weeks to clear became a dairy farm that's still operating today, though the current owners have no idea that their great-great-grandfather didn't clear that land himself. He hired Lars Gustiffson's crew to do it, and 20 immigrant workers with names like Ole and Sven and Henrik and Nils Olsson did the actual labor. 200 acres near Rice Lake became the site of a cheese factory that processed milk from 30 surrounding farms, all of them on land that had been stump-covered wilderness 20 years earlier. The cheese from that factory fed families across Wisconsin and Illinois. It built a regional economy. It made the factory owner wealthy. The men who cleared the land got their $2 a day. The scale of what happened across the cutover region is hard to comprehend without numbers. So here are the numbers. In 1870, Barron County, Wisconsin had a population of 686 people. Most of them were lumber workers, living in camps that moved as the timber was cut. By 1900, the population had reached over 25,000. Farmers and their families, merchants and tradespeople, all supported by an agricultural economy that hadn't existed 30 years earlier. The entire county had been solid forest when the first settlers arrived. Old-growth white pine, with trees so thick that on some days the sun never reached the forest floor. By the turn of the century, it was checkered with farms, pastures and cornfields and dairy operations, all of them on land that had been forest, and then stumps, and then, finally, clear. Wisconsin as a whole went from producing almost no dairy products in 1870 to being the #1 dairy state in America by 1920. The cheese, the butter, the milk that made Wisconsin famous, all of it came from land that had been covered with stumps 50 years earlier. Minnesota's wheat fields tell the same story. Michigan's orchards, the corn that feeds the cattle that become the beef on your table. All of it grew in soil that men like Lars Gustiffson's crews had to rip those stumps out of first. The Hercules Manufacturing Company built about 150,000 stump pullers between 1885 and 1920. If each one pulled an average of 5,000 stumps over its working life, That's 750 million stumps. 750 million obstacles removed from the path of American agriculture. And behind each of those 750 million stumps was a man. A man crawling in the dirt to hook a chain. A man walking circles behind a horse team until his feet were raw. A man handling cable that could kill him if it snapped. A man earning $2 a day to transform a wilderness into a farm that someone else would own. The dairy industry that made Wisconsin famous was built on land that had been impassable wilderness 50 years earlier. The bread you eat comes from wheat that grows in Minnesota soil that supported nothing but pine trees before the stumps came out. The entire agricultural heart of America exists because anonymous men with machines pulled those stumps, one by one, for decades. That transformation didn't happen by itself. It happened because men like Lars Olson, the one who lost the use of his left hand and got $4.50 for it, crawled under stumps in the mud and hooked chains around roots while the mosquitoes swarmed and the sun beat down and the cable sang its warning song. I've tried to find one, a working Hercules stump puller from the Golden Age. They're almost impossible to locate. A few survive in agricultural museums, displayed as curiosities, rusted and silent, with signs that explain what they were in language that captures nothing of what they meant. Most of them haven't moved in 100 years. I visited one at a county historical society in Wisconsin a few years back. It sat behind a rope barrier in a shed at the back of the property. The paint had long since weathered away. The wooden frame was cracked and gray. The wood dried out and split after decades of sitting in that shed. The cable was gone, leaving just the empty drum at the center. A small sign explained what it was. A stump-pulling machine manufactured by the Hercules Company of Centerville, Iowa, circa 1895. Used for land clearing in the cutover region of northern Wisconsin. That was all. No mention of the men who operated it. No mention of the 40 horses that turned the sweep arm. No mention of the 47,312 stumps, or the 185 tons of feed, or the 23 snapped cables. No mention of the $127 in injury settlements that worked out to $6 per man for a season of broken bones and crushed hands and backs that gave out permanently. I stood there for a long time looking at that machine. Nobody else stopped. Families walked past on their way to the livestock exhibits. Kids ran by without a glance. It was just an old machine, rusted and forgotten, a curiosity from another age that had nothing to do with their lives. But I kept thinking about the ledgers, about the names that appeared as entries next to dollar amounts and then vanished. Ole, Sven, Henrik, Gunnar. Lars Olson, who lost the use of his left hand on July 14, 1899, and got $4.50 for it. Men who had names, who had families somewhere in Sweden or Norway or Finland, who had dreams of something better than crawling under stumps in the Wisconsin mud for $2 a day, who did the work that made the modern Midwest possible, and then disappeared so completely that we don't even know what happened to them. They transformed this country. They took a wilderness and turned it into farmland. They created millions of dollars in value with their hands and their backs and their daily wages that wouldn't feed a family. And then they disappeared into other jobs, other seasons, other anonymous labor that built America while leaving no trace of the builders. We drive through the Midwest now and see flat farmland stretching to the horizon, corn and wheat and soybeans, cows grazing in pastures, silos reaching up toward the sky. We assume it was always like this. We assume the land came ready-made for agriculture, that someone just had to show up and plant seeds. It wasn't like that. It was never like that. Every acre of that farmland was a battlefield once. Every field you pass was covered with stumps that men had to pull, one by one, with machines that could kill them, and wages that wouldn't support a family. The cows grazing in those pastures stand on ground that anonymous workers cleared with their bodies. The wheat waving in those fields grows in soil that immigrant laborers exposed to the sun for the first time in 10,000 years. The Hercules stump puller was one of the great machines of American agriculture. It solved an impossible problem. It opened millions of acres to farming. It fed a nation. But the machine was nothing without the men. The drivers and hookmen and cable handlers who worked 14-hour days for $2. The crews who ate dust and swatted mosquitoes and dodged snapping cables while the stumps came up one after another after another. I wish I could tell you their names, all of their names. I wish I could tell you what happened to them after the stumps were gone. I wish I could show you photographs of their faces, tell you stories about their lives, give them the recognition they earned with their labor. But the records don't exist. The photographs were never taken. The stories were never written down. They did the work, and then they disappeared, leaving behind nothing but the farmland they created and the faded entries in company ledgers that nobody reads anymore. Lars Gustiffson died in 1934. His obituary in the Barron County newspaper mentioned that he had been a prominent businessman. It mentioned his 6 children and his membership in the Lutheran Church. It mentioned his success in land clearing and real estate. It mentioned nothing about the 20 men who worked for him. Nothing about the 47,312 stumps in a single season. Nothing about the $127 in injury settlements, or Nils Olsson's hand, or the cables that snapped and the chains that broke while men scrambled to get clear. The land he cleared is still there. Farms and fields and dairy operations that have been running for over a century now, passed down through generations who have no idea what it took to make that land farmable in the first place. And the men who did the actual work? Their names appear once in a ledger, and then never again. $2 a day, $6 for a season of injuries, and the knowledge, which they could never spend and never pass on, that they had transformed worthless wilderness into some of the most productive farmland in America. That's the debt we owe them. Not money, because they're long dead, and their descendants, if they have any, are impossible to trace. But acknowledgement, recognition that the Midwest didn't just happen, that someone had to make it, that the stumps didn't pull themselves. So this is what we have instead, this story. This acknowledgement that the agricultural heartland of America was built by men who are forgotten, that the food on your table comes from soil that anonymous workers cleared with machines that could kill them, for wages that wouldn't feed a family. Next time you drive through Wisconsin or Minnesota or Michigan, through all those miles of flat farmland that seem to go on forever, think about what it looked like before. Think about the stumps. Think about the machines. Think about the men. And maybe say their names, even though you don't know what they were. Ole, Sven, Henrik, Gunnar, Nils Olsson. The anonymous workers who built the agricultural heart of America, one stump at a time, for $2 a day. They earned more than that. They earned at least this much: being remembered, being acknowledged, being thanked for what they gave so that we could eat. That's the story of the Hercules stump puller, the machine that made America's farmland possible, and the men who operated it, whose names we'll never know, but whose work we eat every single day. Every single day.